Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Robert Lustig, who is Professor of Pediatric Endocrinology at the University of California in San Francisco, and he's a leading public health authority on the impact that sugar has on fueling the diabetes, obesity, and metabolic syndrome epidemics. On today's episode, we talk about metabolic disease, intermittent fasting, different types of sugars, and artificial sweeteners, supplements, medications, and so much more. So stay tuned. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Robert Lustig. Dr. Lustig is Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics, Division of Endocrinology at the University of California in San Francisco. Dr. Lustig has become a leading public health authority on the impact sugar has on fueling the diabetes, obesity, and metabolic syndrome epidemics, and on addressing changes in the food environment to reverse these chronic diseases. He has authored 125 peer-reviewed articles, 73 reviews, and he's also a New York Times bestselling author of several books, but particularly Fat Chance, his first book, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity, and Disease, where he documents both the science and the politics that have led to the current pandemic of obesity and chronic disease. He's also had a really long run and continues to have a long run on YouTube with a wonderful video that I actually prescribe to my patients called Sugar, the Bitter Truth, which continues to be very popular. I looked at it this morning, 21 million views over 13 years. It's just a wonderful talk and very insightful, as I hope this talk today will be. Dr. Lustig, thank you so much for being here and taking the time to talk to myself and the Smart Human audience.
No, thanks so much, Ailey. I don't understand how that YouTube video is still even up and running. It makes no sense to me. I didn't think my mother would watch it, and indeed she didn't.
Well, she watched it 21 million times. That's why.
That was my father who watched it 21 million times.
Good. Yeah. Well, that's a supportive parent for you. I watched it a long time ago. I have watched your work over the years. I wanted to start with a big question instead of going right into the minutia, which we'll get into, I hope. Similar to my career, I'm sure your career is, as you discuss in your new book, by the way, Metabolical, which we'll get into as well, you kind of started off as a regular doctor. You followed the path, you followed the rules, you took the tests, all the steps, you drank the Kool-Aid, although you wouldn't do it now, I bet. Just curious. How did you get here and now, if you could sort of look back over these years of a wonderful, illustrious career?
Right. It's a really good question. It totally came through the back door. The one thing that set me up for my path was actually college. Mm-hmm. So I went to MIT for undergrad, and I majored in nutritional biochemistry. And they taught me back then, 1973 to 1976, that a calorie was not a calorie, that different foods were metabolized different ways, that in fact, nutrition was more than just, reading off a list of, things off the side of a package. We didn't even have a side of a package back then. That came in 1990. But that, that this thing called metabolism mattered. And then I went to medical school and they beat it out of me. And they basically told me, none of that's important. That's not how we take care of patients. That's not what we do. If a patient's obese, it's about calories. They eat too much. They exercise too little. It's a behavioral issue. If they're fat, it's their fault. If you prescribe something and it doesn't work, they're non-compliant. These were the, touchstones of standard medical practice.
And they still are. Would you argue that still are?
And they still are. Yeah. It's changing, but very, very slowly. So I had this dichotomy thrown at me very early on in my career. On the other hand, I was paying good money, to go to med school to learn how the quote gurus did it. And I sort of forgot about it. And originally my goal was to take care of short kids. I became a pediatric endocrinologist because I was really interested in growth hormone and growth. And, at that point in time, Genentech had, become a big issue and, a company. And we now had, recombinant growth hormone, and everyone was doing growth hormone studies. And that's what I thought I was gearing up to do, and then short kids got fat on me. And no one seemed to have an answer for what that was. Now, years earlier, I had learned about an animal paradigm, an experimental paradigm where you put an electrode in the hypothalamus of a rat, and you buzz, and you basically kill those neurons, and those animals became massively obese. So this was called hypothalamic obesity, and it's been known since 1901, since Freilich and Babinski's time. They were the original describers of the phenomenon, and no one knew what caused it. Now, I, as a pediatric neuroendocrinologist, started working at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, where they had a lot of these patients. So these, kids who had a brain tumor, who had surgery or radiation, and became massively obese after their treatment. And the parents would, complain to me, this is double jeopardy. My kid survived the tumor only to succumb to the therapy because, before the tumor, they were totally normal weight, and now they weigh 400 pounds. And this couldn't possibly be behavior. This couldn't possibly be noncompliance. It coincided directly with the time of the tumor. So I recalled back the issues of a calorie is not a calorie from college. And I recalled back, this electrolytic lesion of the hypothalamus in these animals. And I said, well, and this was also the time of the advent of the hormone leptin, which was, first cloned in 1994. And so now we had a pathway between the fat cell and the brain to relay information about energy sufficiency. So here I was at St. Jude with 40 kids, all massively overweight, and all having trouble, and I had to do something for them. So I recalled this, phenomenon. I said, what can I do as an endocrinologist? I'm not a neurosurgeon. Right. I can't fix a brain. What can I do to try to help these kids? Well, we knew that these animals had enormously high levels of the hormone insulin. And so and we knew that these kids had enormously high levels of the hormone insulin. I said, well, maybe if we knock their insulin levels down, because after all, insulin's the energy storage hormone. Maybe if I got the insulin down, maybe the weight gain would slow down. And so there's a drug that's available to endocrinologists, which I knew about, called octreotide. It's usually used to suppress growth hormone, but I repurposed it because it also suppresses insulin. And so we gave octreotide to 8 of these kids in an open label pilot study. And lo and behold, not only did they lose weight, which was the first time anybody had ever demonstrated weight loss in one of these patients. Not only did they lose weight, but something even more remarkable happened. They started exercising spontaneously. These were kids who sat on the couch, ate Doritos, and slept. These were kids who had basically checked out of daily life. And the reason was because they didn't have the energy to participate in daily life. And now, on the medicine, all of a sudden, they're active. One kid became the competitive swimmer. 2 kids started lifting weights at home. 1 kid became the manager of his high school basketball team, running around collecting all the basketballs. These were kids who did nothing. They were lumps on a log. The parents would, complain, that, they had, lost their child, not to the, to the tumor, but to the therapy.
Right.
And all of a sudden they're saying, I got my kid back. And the kid would say, this is the first time my head hasn't been in the clouds since the tumor. And I'm going like, this is really weird. This was totally unexpected. So we ended up doing a double-blind placebo-controlled trial in the same group of patients in a different, in a double-blind setup. Mm-hmm. And this time we built a quality of life questionnaire and an activity questionnaire into the study. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, when we got the insulin down, not only did the patients, lose weight, but their activity improved. So what this demonstrated to me was that the behaviors that we associate with obesity, the gluttony and the sloth, are really actually biochemically driven through insulin. And what I then realized was I needed to get the insulin down. And so we started then getting insulin down in everybody, not just these kids, because everybody had high insulin levels. We now secrete 2 to 4 times the amount of insulin that we did just 40 years ago. And the question then was, well, if you don't have a brain tumor, why are you making 2 to 4 times the amount of insulin if you don't have a lesion in your head? Mm-hmm. And that was when sugar sort of reared its ugly head. And I remembered back to my, college days when I learned that this molecule in sugar called fructose was handled differently than glucose. And that fructose was a preferred lipogenic substrate. It made fat in the liver. And when your liver gets fatty, and everyone now has fatty liver, 45% of American adults now have fatty liver. When your liver gets fatty, your pancreas has to make extra insulin to make the liver do its job. And that's the reason why everyone has high insulin. So that then said to me, all right, it's the food. It's not the patient, it's the food. And that's when I made that YouTube video in 2009. And I've been, so that was my aha moment. That was my, sort of awakening, if you will. I would say you were
pretty fearless. And one of the things that really struck me, even 13 years ago, and you were talking about your daughter in kindergarten. I mean, so I kind of got a phase of where you were in your career, and you were pissed. You were pissed, and you could hear it.
I'm still pissed.
And I know, that's why I'm wondering, how much more pissed could you be after 13 more years? I mean, it's frustrating. And you've been really touting this for a very long time, and you've been fighting the system, the medical establishment. Although you're in the medical establishment, you're fighting from within, which is a completely different perspective than coming from the outside, where people can just write you off. That's why I find it so fascinating.
Right. The fact of the matter is that if you try to, alter things from the inside, people basically diss you. We've seen this throughout, the entire medical, history. In fact, I'm actually helping somebody right now who's trying to fix the orthodontic field from the inside. You make a lot of enemies. There's no question about it. On the other hand, you have to maintain your credibility. So if you go completely outside, then you're just completely dismissed out of hand. So it's a tightrope to walk, to be sure, to maintain your academic credibility and at the same time, sort of try to steer the ship and turn it around.
I respect. As I'm coming through this field, I'm a little younger than you, not that much younger, but younger than you. And I'm starting to, with the environmental health world and the endocrine disruptors and all the people that I work with, that, it's an uphill battle. And I don't know if I'm really in the system academically. Personally, I'm an outside physician, but I also have the freedom to speak a lot more freely than I would perhaps if I was in a conventional rheumatology practice or work for a hospital system. And I think that's the challenge is how much freedom do you have to say the truth, and, it's an interesting position.
Yeah, the fact is that academic medicine is the worst because never has so much been fought over for so little. Ultimately.
What a great line.
Washington, it's power, and Wall Street, it's money. But, in academic medicine, it's credit. Really? credit. that's
But that's what we were
what's driving
taught.
people.
We were taught this sort of, cold process of, we valued our mentors that were 100 years old, that were sort of internal medicine gurus. And if you got, a great score from them on rotations, you were like, that was what my husband remembers his good remark, mark from internal medicine from the big guy, So it's just one of these cultures that you're in it. So you don't realize how kind of silly in many ways there are, with it.
Right.
And I think it takes a strong person to really see something outside of it and be able to, to not go along. Although people, their salaries are paid, by these groups. They're passed out, you have to think, I got to put my kid through college and I have to,
Right.
pay for braces. So, it's just one of those things where it's always a challenge of integrity, time, effort, and finances, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. And, there were times in my career when I was worried about that. I'm not going to tell you I didn't. But, what I did was I stuck to the science.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I made sure that everything that I said, everything I wrote, everything I did was eminently defensible with the science. And in doing so, I've been able to, shall we say, quote, keep my nose clean, at least from an academic standpoint. Now, I will tell you, I have colleagues who, they've done the right thing and they've still gotten cold on the carpet. Like I said, this orthodontist now who is, in trouble that we're trying to help. Tim Noakes in South Africa almost had his license revoked because he was giving people information on ketogenic diets. Gary Fettke in Australia, who was an orthopedic surgeon who basically he himself had a pituitary tumor that he was able to stop growing on a ketogenic diet. And so he was advocating ketogenic diets for some of his patients, and he got brought up on charges. Evelyn Bordeaux-Roy in Quebec, same thing. So this is happening, inappropriately to various physicians who are trying to do the right thing.
Right.
And, the fact is that the establishment cannot defend its current stance because everybody is sick.
Right. So let's get into that, because your book, and I'm going to hold it up because I actually loved it. And I don't just say that lightly because I never have time to read. So this is like a big steep curve when I actually read a book, even by a colleague. That book was really excellent. I love the way it was laid out. I love how you talked about the problems and you sort of, moved into the solutions in such a seamless way. Tell us how sick we are as a country, compare us to others, and then, give us the big picture, because we think we're so fantastic. The United States is so fantastic. Our water is so clean. Don't get me started. So you jump in and do your thing, or else I'm going to go get a drink. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of subterfuge out there. Happy talk is just that. It's happy talk. And we have a big problem. But what we've done is we've siloed it away. And we basically make it the patient's fault. The fact is that type 2 diabetes, when I was a med student in 1976, was 2.5% of people over the age of 65 and 0.1% of people under the age of 65. Okay. And I know because I did a paper on it. Today, type 2 diabetes is 9.4% of everyone over age 20. Now, how does that happen? Because we're all gluttons and sloths all at the same time?
Right.
Because we're all healthy? In fact, it has now been shown that 88% of the American population has some form of metabolic dysfunction. So that is not exactly what you would call a healthy population. And if you look at the graph of healthcare expenditures versus life expectancy, which I have in my book, it's figure 1-1, you can see that, in fact, the rest of the OECD countries, the rest of the 37 developed countries around the world, they're all kind of fit. Yeah, that's the one. They're all kind of fitting together. They're not doing as well as they used to, but ultimately they're not different from each other. The only country that's really different is us. America. We spend more and more, and our lifespan is going down and down. And it is actually because we're spending more that our lifespan is going down, as opposed to the other way around.
How do you explain
that? And people
that?
don't understand that. Oh, very simple. Because we think there's a pill for this. And we're really the only industrialized society that has basically given up on preventative medicine. Every other country still believes in it.
It's not even taught in medical school.
We don't even teach it. We don't even teach it.
Even right now, 2022, 5 to 8 hours of nutrition taught in 4 years of medical school. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, in fact, there are only 28% of American medical schools have a nutrition curriculum, even today, 28%. And in those 28%, there is a total of 19.6 contact hours median. Now, when you consider that a standard medical education is about 6,000 contact hours, 19.6, to be able to cover 75% of all healthcare costs, I mean, that's pretty lopsided. And so this is the problem. And
well, who subsidizes medical schools, Dr. Lustig?
So that's where it comes from. It's
yes.
Big Pharma subsidizes 80% of medical school costs. They don't want it taught. Because if doctors actually knew how to prescribe preventative medicine, maybe they wouldn't sell as many drugs. So we have various stakeholders that are sort of muddying the waters. And we have seen this, before. We saw this with tobacco. We saw this with alcohol. We saw this with opioids. And we have now, completely seen this with climate change. So the fact of the matter is there are people who are happy with the status quo. There are people who actually want to make it worse. And the food situation is no different. In fact, the food situation is inexorably linked to all of these. It's linked to tobacco, it's linked to alcohol, it's linked to opioids, and it's linked to climate change. The fact of the matter is, I think food is sort of the integral issue that we have to solve if we're going to solve any of the others.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's so tied to everything. I emphasize water as well, but water is, even though we drink more water per 24 hours, per 72 hours, we can't live without it. People don't focus on water as a contaminant, endocrine disrupting issue, which is a whole nother topic for another time.
Well,
but you're right. And
it's not really
it's
a
up
different
to you.
topic.
Do you want to comment on that? Because that's an area that I just get pissed about because we consume it regularly. No one understands the Safe Drinking Water Act. Nothing's changed in terms of our water system, 91 chemicals under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Nothing's changed in 50 years. And now we're getting inundated by these chemicals, PFAS chemicals, lead, chromium-6. I mean, the list goes on. And yet we're complaining about fats and this diet and sugars and carbs and exercise and calories in, calories out. And I just think, wow, we're 85% water.
Well, so I am going to be attending. We just actually wrote 3 papers in biochemical pharmacology that came out about 4 months ago on obesogens, environmental obesogens. And we are now, 2 weeks from today, we are going to be having a workshop in outside Chicago to discuss the whole obesogen hypothesis. Now, obesogens are endocrine disruptors that specifically drive chronic metabolic disease. Now, there are other endocrine disruptors that drive reproductive problems and cognitive problems, et cetera. But this is specifically for obesity and diabetes, this field. And there are many obesogens that are in the water. And there are also many obesogens that are in the food. So we are very clear on this. It's not just the water, Haley, it's the air. Okay, air pollution is a primary obesogen. And so, how do you get away from that? Okay, there's stuff in packaging of food that is an obesogen. And of course, there's stuff you put in the food. Now, the question is, how severe is the problem? Now, back of envelope calculation, I put that problem, the obesogen problem, at around 20% of the problem. Now, that's not small. That's big, but there's one thing that's bigger, and that is sugar. And sugar is a bigger problem because it is both an obesogen and a diabetogen. And the reason is because the molecule fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar, the molecule that we all seek, the molecule that makes sugar, the addictive drug it is a mitochondrial toxin. And it's a mitochondrial toxin in the liver, and it's a mitochondrial toxin in the brain. So it shouldn't be too surprising that we have this epidemic of fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and dementia. And by the way, cancer while we're at it.
And autoimmune disease. Did you say that? I didn't catch that.
I didn't say that, but that's in there too because of the effects of sugar on the microbiome.
Correct.
And on gut permeability. So I'm gonna step out here and say, Ailey, that you are right, but I'm more right.
Well, you're my guest, so you're definitely more right.
That only because of the burden that this places on society.
Right.
No, the water is an issue, the air is an issue, but I'll tell you, I think the food's a bigger issue.
I gotcha. So tell me about fructose. So, it was interesting. I came to work and all of a sudden I started getting insecure because I knew I was preparing for this conversation, and I put my, organic Earl Grey and my organic cane sugar, 4 teaspoons. I thought, now I'm going to get yelled at.
4 teaspoons.
4 teaspoons, because it lasts all day. It's like 40 ounces, it's instead of cookies and cakes. And I started to think, well, what is corn? What is, it's been a while. What is just regular cane sugar? And it's organic, which is what I tout because of those less chemicals, less endocrine disruptors. I really promote cleaner food. But it's sucrose is glucose plus fructose.
Right.
And then now tell us about fructose and how much is that component of sucrose a problem for everybody but me, particularly with my tea? And is there a way to get a sweetener eventually without the fructose, which is really one of the bad guys here?
Right. So the bottom line is that all caloric sweeteners are sweetened with fructose. Molasses is only glucose.
Molasses is only interesting.
But molasses is not that sweet. I mean, you don't see people going around chugging molasses, do you?
No, but also molasses has acrylamide and some of these chemicals that offset.
Sure.
People think, great, I'm going to do that now, but then you think, oh, there's some other issues there.
Of course. But the bottom line is molasses is devoid of the addictive substance. Okay? So molasses is not a big seller. Yeah, it might be okay in a cookie, but only because you put the sugar in too. So the bottom line is that there are these 2 molecules, and the food industry equates them. It says these are the same. A calorie is a calorie, a sugar is a sugar. Now, if you believe that a calorie is a calorie, then what you're saying is that the problem is calories in, calories out, because calories are fungible. Therefore, if calories are the same, then it's, too many calories in, too few calories out. Energy balance, that's their term. Every, CPG company, calls this energy balance. Okay, and if that's the case, then it's 2 behaviors, gluttony and sloth. Therefore, if you're fat, it's your fault. Therefore, diet and exercise. Therefore, any calorie can be part of a balanced diet. Therefore, don't pick on our calories, go pick on somebody else's calories. So all of those mantras that I just listed are dependent on this notion that calories are fungible. That every calorie is like every other calorie. Okay? And if a sugar were a sugar, and if glucose were fructose, then they would be right. But it's not. And we have the biochemistry, and we've had the biochemistry for 50 years to show that this is not the case. We've actually had it since 1967 to show that this is not the case. And I learned it in college, that it was not the case. But the food industry continues to say it, and the reason is because this is how they assuage their culpability. This is their shield. This is how they keep the FDA and the plaintiff's bar, from taking them down.
Yeah.
Is with this notion, but it's completely false.
Right.
And we have the data to show this. We have it every which way from Sunday. Okay, so let's talk about the two different sugars, glucose and fructose. Glucose is the energy of life. Every cell on the planet burns glucose for energy. Glucose is so goddamn important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it. You will remember from your Biochem 101, there's a process called gluconeogenesis.
Right.
And it will turn amino acids into glucose, and it will turn glycerol into glucose.
It's anthropology.
In the liver. It's anthropology. Okay. Animals who are, devoid of food, like polar bears, they have to be able to still generate a glucose level. And so they will turn fat into glucose in the liver.
Right.
Ketotic hypoglycemia is when, that gluconeogenesis problem, issue in the liver is not fully mature in babies. And so they end up running out of glucose and their blood glucose drops and they have a seizure and they show up in our emergency room and I take care of them. So there's, loads of data to understand how important glucose is. However, having said that, glucose is not important to eat. It is important to have a blood glucose level, but it is not important to have a dietary glucose content. Not the same. And the reason is because you can make it. Okay. It's not essential to eat. It's essential to have, but it's not essential to eat.
Okay.
Big difference.
Yeah.
Now, fructose, on the other hand, this other sugar, the sweet sugar, the molecule we seek, is a whole different ballgame. So there is no biochemical reaction in any vertebrate on the planet that requires dietary fructose. It is completely vestigial to all animal life. It is a holdover from our plant ancestors. And it's why they're plants and not humans. Okay. They got stuck, in terms of evolution with fructose. And fructose is, it's an okay way to store energy, but it's not a great way. Okay. But what it did do was it got animals to like that molecule. And so they would eat the fruit and therefore scatter their seeds. So it was their evolutionary construct to propagating their species.
Right. There has to be a reason to be eating it so that, they could keep going with their genetic offspring, the seeds, the plants, the fruit. Yes.
Right. The problem is that when you consume a large fructose load, like a 20-ounce Coca-Cola, it's going straight to the liver. The rest of the body cannot utilize it for energy. It goes straight to the liver, and the liver becomes overwhelmed. The mitochondria, the little energy burning factories inside each of our cells, can't handle the onslaught. And in order to deal with it, it turns that excess into liver fat. And that's where the fatty liver comes from. And that's why 45% of Americans today have fatty liver when they never did before.
It doesn't raise insulin, though, but it goes to fat. Yes, it does. Oh, it does raise, fructose does raise insulin.
So it does it in two ways. Number one, if your liver's not working right because you have fatty liver, your pancreas has to make more insulin to tell the liver to do its job. That's one. And it turns out that if you overwhelm your liver has what's called hepatic first pass extraction. And so it will, the fructose is coming from the gut via the portal vein to the liver. The liver is going to try to extract as much as it can on that first pass. And it's pretty good. It does about an 85% extraction. Okay. Which means that you're not going to get a serum fructose level. Unless you overload it. And if you overload it, you will generate a serum fructose level. And you will be able to measure it in the peripheral blood. So now the fructose is circulating in the bloodstream on the arterial side, and that will then go to the pancreas. And it turns out there is a fructose receptor in the beta cell. And when that fructose hits that beta cell, the beta cell goes hog wild and secretes a lot of insulin, because that fructose signal is telling the beta cell is, oh my God, the liver's in trouble, make more insulin to try to deal with it. So there is this sort of emergency system in the beta cell to increase the insulin in response to seeing fructose, which shouldn't be there.
Right. And fructose, just to remind my listeners, because not all of them are academic or medical or whatever, basically it's component of what are the foods that have fructose that are really bad guys?
Well, all of them.
Well, high fructose corn syrup is something that people might recognize on a label and something they could really try to avoid. Certain fruits are higher in fructose than others.
Right. So the bottom line is that any caloric sweetener, and there are 5, there's sucrose, table sugar, cane sugar, beet sugar, the stuff you put in coffee, high fructose corn syrup, which only the industry uses. You can't buy that, at the store. Honey, maple syrup, and agave. Okay. Those are all basically 50% glucose, 50% fructose.
What about monk sugar or monk? Yeah.
Monk fruit. Monk fruit is a non-caloric sweetener. So it does not have calories. It binds to taste receptors, but it does not actually have calories.
But it's fructose and glucose.
No, it's not.
It's not. Okay.
It's not. Monk fruit is not either. It's neither glucose nor fructose. It doesn't have calories. It is a diet sweetener. Stevia is a diet sweetener. Erythritol is a diet sweetener. There's a host. There are lots of synthetic diet sweeteners like aspartame and neotame and azosulfame K, and new ones coming out, allulose and tagatose and what have you. Everybody's looking for the diet sweetener that's going to solve the problem.
The next packet with a different color, which might be purple.
Yeah.
Which I did want to, by the way, unless you want to finish up on your points there, I kind of want to get into the recent study that I thought was excellent from Cell Biology, or it was from Cell. Maybe you can explain it. I thought it was fascinating, and you said it was basically a landmark study, which I think is a pretty strong statement.
Yep. So to just finish up what we were talking about, fructose goes to the liver, gets turned into fat, and that fat then gums up the works. And it is the insulin response to a sick liver that is driving all the chronic metabolic disease. It's also driving the obesity, because the insulin is causing whatever energy is in your bloodstream to go into fat cells for storage. So fructose is an obesogen because it causes obesity irrespective of its calories. If fructose was just calories, then it wouldn't be an obesogen.
Got it.
But because it causes this insulin resistance problem, it is an obesogen. And so we were talking about the compounds that are in the food that cause the problem. This, to me, is the biggest one.
Right.
And that's why I think, yes, water is an issue.
Yeah.
Yes, air is an issue.
Yeah.
Yes, everything you're, trying to, teach the public is definitely there and valid, and I approve and I agree and I say so. Okay. But fructose is the big kahuna. It's the 2,000-pound gorilla.
Yeah, I think it's great. And then more of what I read about, fructose causing more problems with insulin, glucose resistance, is that it affects blood pressure because of the effects on the kidney and the sort of the cycles there. Makes you more hungry. So there's effect on ghrelin and leptin. Am I correct on that? So it has all these cycles kind of spin off of our food.
Exactly.
And particularly fructose in this case. Yeah.
And the problem is that 74% of all the items in the American grocery store are spiked with sugar on purpose, because the food industry knows, because it's addictive, when they add it, you buy more. And I can even prove that. We have an economic proof of that. It's called price elasticity. So this is an economic term. What it says is, how much will consumption change in a given item when the price goes up? Now, if the price goes up, consumption should go down, right? That's called price elasticity.
Right, sure.
So a price elastic food would be something where when the price goes up, you stop eating it.
Mm-hmm.
An example of that would be eggs.
Mm-hmm.
Eggs are price elastic. When the price of eggs goes up, people stop eating eggs.
Meat, right? Sure, expensive.
Meat,
item.
not as much, but
Really?
eggs.
Yeah.
Eggs
Okay.
are the famous one. And the reason is because there's nothing addictive in eggs. What is the most price inelastic food? The top three are fast food, soda, juice.
Got it.
Bottom line is when the price of those go up, people keep consuming them.
Right.
And the reason is because they're addictive.
Well, what do you think about soda taxes for that matter then? Do you see? That never really seemed to take off in a big way. They got in big trouble. The mayors of, California, Dinkins, I think it was. And
No, not Dinkins.
New York. Bloomberg got in trouble, I think, at one point. They were giving him trouble. But anyway.
Well, Bloomberg did never propose a soda tax. What he proposed was a big gulp ban. That's different. So he basically said nothing larger than 16 ounces being sold at a store. And that's, and then of course the question was, well, if that's the case, then, dispenser drinks are a problem because, people can bring their own bottles. And it was based on faulty logic. I mean, I can get into the legalities with you. I actually studied this in law school. But the bottom line is soda taxes do work. Now, we have soda taxes in 6 cities in America: San Francisco, Oakland, Albany, a few other. Philadelphia has one. And we also have soda taxes in 28 countries around the world: Mexico, South Africa, Australia, a few other places. Okay, so the bottom line is the reason that they are there is because they do work. Now, the question is a soda tax the right way to handle this problem? That is a complicated question. And I will tell you, it is not the right way, but it may be the only way. And here's the reason. I'm not really for soda taxes. And here's why. It's really 3 taxes in one. It's not 1 tax, it's 3. The first tax is called a subsidy. It's not called a tax, it's called a subsidy. But it is a tax. Because if you subsidize something like sugar, that means you're taxing everything else to make book, because you can't give a subsidy and not then raise the price on everything else. Otherwise, you'll go bankrupt.
Right.
Okay. So the concept of food subsidies don't make sense because what they do is they distort the market.
Okay.
And any economist knows this. But, we're propping up the sugar industry and the corn industry. And so we have, corn subsidies, and we have sugar subsidies, and we have wheat subsidies. All the stuff that's killing us, we subsidize, which is like dumb. That's where the problem really is fixing the subsidies. But that's the Farm Bill. And, that's like the third rail of American politics.
Right.
Because then, Iowa gets mad, So then the second tax, we don't call it tax either. We call it a premium. It's the premium on your healthcare insurance.
Right. Because
you, Dr. Ailey Cohen, are paying $2,750 per year on your insurance for obesity-related healthcare, even though you're not obese. Because you're paying for everybody else's obesity. Because the healthcare industry, the insurance industry, basically, they have to make book. And if they paid for everybody's diabetes, where are they going to get the money from? They have to charge you. And they have to charge your employer. Well, you're paying for that. So that's a second tax. Just don't call it a tax.
Right.
And then the third tax is the actual soda tax itself.
Right. A lot of smoke and mirrors, basically. Yeah.
Yes, it's really 3 taxes in one. And the way I see fixing this problem is getting rid of the food subsidies, because there's no economist who believes in food subsidies anyway.
Why can't you run for office? Are you retired now?
Well, I am retired, and I will tell you that I do not want to run for office. Because if I ran for office, first of all, I'd have even more haters than I already do, which is a lot.
At a certain point, doesn't it hit a maximum where you don't care? It's like sunscreen. You go above it, who cares? The SPF.
My job is to produce the science and bring the science to the policy. It is not to effectuate the policy. That we have to rely on professional politicians for. But the problem is that the politicians are all bought off by big food.
Yeah, it
and
doesn't seem like there's a great
fix.
solution. I wish all the researchers would be in politics, but they don't go as far as to even give recommendations because that's not their area. So, you know, it's difficult.
It's a big problem. The fact is that the ivory tower physicians, they're actually afraid of their grants being rescinded, for various reasons. And so they will not speak up.
And they're also sponsored by the drug companies, which is so, every single great paper seems to have a disclosure that's, 4 paragraphs long now.
Indeed.
So anyway,
so this is a problem.
Yeah. We have not that much time left, but I want to use every second because I wrote a couple, I just wanted a couple. You can certainly talk whatever you'd like. I wanted to get a couple thoughts on medications, which is a very big topic, but statins in particularly, I'm treating patients all the time and I'm calling cardiologists and trying to figure out why this is necessary. And I'm asked, tell the audience a little, I know this is a long topic, but see what you can share with us that's quick and easy and understandable.
Sure. So the U.S. Public Health Task Force just 3 days ago came out with their new guidelines, first time in 6 years, on statin use. And so they analyzed all the data. And what they showed was, first of all, if you're over age 76, there's no point at all, which is fine. But if you're under age 76, what they said is that it depends on whether you've had a heart attack or not. If you've had a heart attack, then, statins are great for secondary prevention.
And that's 70 or below, keep it below 70. That's sort of the magic number of LDL, correct?
Right. But the fact of the matter is that for primary prevention in the general population, the effects of statins are very salutary. It's very small, if at all. And actually, 44 meta-analyses of statin use, which was analyzed by Dubroff et al. In 2019, demonstrated essentially no significant effect of statins on primary prevention. And this U.S. Public Health Task Force basically said that the data is extraordinarily weak.
And primary prevention, to clarify to this audience, means what?
It means if you've never had a heart attack.
Right. So it's preventing your first heart attack, your first stroke. That's primary prevention.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Once you've had one, then you've basically declared yourself and, that you have a specific problem. And, therefore, the statins may be a little bit more appropriate.
Okay.
So I'm not totally against statins, but, you got to use it for the right reason. And right now we're using it for everybody. And that's a problem. Now, here's the big issue. And this is why the whole statin field is just in a complete, absolute mess. There's not one LDL. There are 2. Okay. Now, when you measure LDL on your blood panel, you're measuring both at the same time. There are ways to separate the 2, but we're not doing that because that's expensive. So we're only getting one LDL and we're getting 2 species that are being measured at the same time. One is called large buoyant LDL. It is cardiovascularly neutral. It is not the problem. And 80% of the LDL you measure is the large buoyant, which is not the problem. 20% is called small dense LDL. Now, small dense or type B LDLs, sometimes referred to, that's the problem. That's the atherogenic particle. That's the one that's easily oxidized. That's the one that causes inflammation. That's the one that has to go down. But it's only 20% of the total. So it doesn't, the total LDL doesn't really reflect that. The point is that dietary fat raises your large buoyant LDL, but who cares?
Like omega-3s. Can I just get that in? Omega-3s, if you're done right, they're going to raise LDL on the overall, when I hear from a patient or a doctor, they could raise it. They lower triglycerides, but they raise a little LDL possibly, but they're not bad. That's
they actually lower omega-3s actually lower triglycerides.
They lower triglycerides, but
and triglycerides are way more important than LDL. The hazard risk ratio for LDL and heart disease is 1.3. The hazard risk ratio for triglycerides and heart disease is 1.8. So 50% more important than LDL. But we put all of our eggs in the LDL basket. And the reason was because we had a drug for it. And because pharma told us that was what we should do. Well, it turns out that's not such a good idea. Now, carbohydrate is what drives the small, dense LDL, in particular sugar. It's driving that small, dense LDL. When you take a statin, yes, you are lowering your LDL. That is true. But you are lowering the large buoyant, which is not the problem.
Right.
It's not doing anything to the small dense. So on paper, it looks like your LDL is going down. But in reality, the bad guy is still there. And that's why for primary prevention, statins don't have very much of an effect. So I think that we've gotten this whole LDL mishmash completely wrong, and we have to rethink it. The point is we have to rethink our diet before we can rethink our LDL.
I think that's super interesting and important. Even, look, in clinical terms, it's very hard to get people off of their statins. Of course, there's even other alternatives to it, plant sterols and, bergamot and, all sorts of other natural components. But what's interesting is most cardiologists don't even put patients on ubiquinol or CoQ10, which LDL carries around the body. Those are part of our metabolism, our mitochondrial support. And so,
well, yes, no. I mean, all that's true. I don't argue that.
Right.
CoQ10 is very important for normal mitochondrial function. The question is, do CoQ10 supplements actually get there?
Right.
And there's data that says that they don't get there very well.
And ubiquinol is more active. So maybe that's the problem with the studies. I don't know. But, certainly there's an argument there that everyone should at least be taking that when they're on a statin.
We've learned that not every nutrient is absorbed equally, and so this is a problem. I'm actually working with a company right now that's trying to increase the level of a polyamine called spermidine, because spermidine helps promote autophagy. The reason that spermidine's not on everyone's lips is because the studies that have given spermidine, it hasn't been absorbed. But, this company has figured out a way to increase its absorption. So just because you take something doesn't mean you get something. And this may very well be the case for CoQ10, ubiquinol, and several of the other supplements. So I'm not a big supplement fan.
My next question was, what do you think of supplements?
Well, the ones that there's actually data for are omega-3s, vitamin C, and vitamin D. Those are the ones we have data for. And even the vitamin D literature is a real mess, too. And I'll tell you, the vitamin D literature gets complicated because there are two pathways for vitamin D. There's the activation pathway to 1,25-dihydroxy-D, but there's also the inactivation pathway to 24,25-dihydroxy-D. It turns out inflammation inactivates your vitamin D, takes it to 24,25. So if you measure 25-hydroxy-D, it looks low. But then when you give people vitamin D supplementation, guess what? The 25-hydroxy-D doesn't go up. And the reason is because it's all being shunted to the inactivation pathway. Why? Well, because you're inflamed. And because vitamin D...
Yeah. So how do you deal with that? You have to take away the inflammation and then they'll start absorbing...
Exactly.
Because some people think supplements come first to take down inflammation, but you're arguing...
I think it's the other way around.
Okay.
I think the inflammation has to go down in order to make the supplements work.
That's interesting. And we're nutrient deficient as a culture anyway. That's a whole separate topic for another day. Independent.
Well, that's because of our food.
Right.
Because our food's been bred. Because you know what? Micronutrients don't taste that good.
Right. Right.
Okay, so
and no one wants... exactly.
All of our apples and oranges and tomatoes and everything have all been bred to be sweeter.
Right.
And that means because they have fewer micronutrients in them, because those nucleic acids, polyphenols, flavonoids, they don't taste that good.
Right. Kids don't want to eat their broccoli. What's going on? Right. But no, it's absolutely true. I appreciate that. So in terms of a clinician like myself with other active clinicians, if you want to check sort of the damage of your diet, if you really wanted to be kind of, show patients, you mentioned in your book, checking not just glucose levels or even so much hemoglobin A1C,
Yeah,
But
those
really
are the,
looking
those
at
are the last ones.
fasting insulin.
Fasting insulin, to me, is the key to the whole story. Now, the problem is that the American Diabetes Association tells doctors not to draw fasting insulin. Now, they do that for two reasons, neither of which is important. But it is true that fasting insulin levels around the world are not standardized. And the reason is because some assays pick up proinsulin too.
Okay.
But so what? Because if your level's high, you got a problem. And then the other reason is because fasting insulin levels are not correlated with obesity. That's right. They're correlated with metabolic health because there are a lot of thin people who are sick too.
Right.
So the two reasons that the American Diabetes Association say don't draw fasting insulin are both specious and wrong. And I have been working tirelessly to get this message out. I will have a debate with anyone from the ADA any day, any time about the role of fasting insulin in terms of monitoring and treating metabolic health. And, they just don't want to go
their recommendations are crazy and to some degree. 24 grams of sugar for a woman in 24 hours added sugar, 36 for a man. I mean, where do you get those numbers? And that's added sugar. Does that mean it's all sugar, fructose, it's a little bit too gross and unspecific.
Well, that was not the American Diabetes Association. That was the American Heart Association.
Oh.
And I actually contributed to those. So, we, using the best data that we had back in 2009, we came up with those numbers, and I actually stand by them. But the American Diabetes Association, they don't think sugar is a problem at all. In fact, if you go to their website right now, it basically says sugar is not the cause of diabetes. And Diabetes UK says the same thing, except they both take money from Coca-Cola. I'm sorry, Pepsi-Cola.
Oh my God, down the rabbit hole. I can't believe it. What do you think of intermittent fasting? These are quick questions, so I don't waste all your time here.
Intermittent fasting works, but for the right patient. So who's the right patient? The reason intermittent fasting works is because it gives the liver a chance to burn off the fat that has developed over the previous 16 hours. So people with fatty liver disease, intermittent fasting will work. Now, if you don't have fatty liver, intermittent fasting is not the answer. So you have to be the right patient. Now, who's the right patient? You have to figure out whether you have fatty liver. How do you do that? Well, you need to go look at your ALT level, your alanine aminotransferase level. And if it's over 25, then you probably have some fat in your liver. So, I'm for intermittent fasting, but I'm for it for the right patient.
I don't think I've ever seen anyone's less than 25 based from Quest and, conventional labs.
That's because everyone's got fatty liver.
Oh, I'm so scared now. All right, I'll be looking. But I have really never seen anything lower than those numbers, than 20, 25. Okay.
When I entered medical school, in 1976, the upper limit of normal for ALT was 25. It's now 40. And the reason is because everyone's got fatty liver. The entire curve has shifted to the right.
And you're okay with the normal ranges within our conventional lab system, because as a clinician, we don't have that many things to offer otherwise people have to pay out of pocket for outside labs.
No, I'm not okay with normal ranges at all. I think the whole normal range needs to be dropped from the lab slip. The reason it's there is because that's $10. That's an interpretation. So the lab actually gets to charge more for an interpretation when you have that H or L, the high or low.
Really?
Okay, so that whole thing is based on a reference range, which is based on, quote, a normal population, except no one's normal. So what good is it?
Need a drink. Okay.
Me too.
Glycemic index. Yes, no, bad, good. Probably not something people were really into the glycemic diets and really looking at which foods.
Glycemic index is a canard. Glycemic load is not. I believe in glycemic load. I do not believe in glycemic index. The perfect example of this is carrots.
Yeah.
So carrots have a high glycemic index. If you eat 50 grams of carbohydrate in carrots, your blood glucose will go pretty high. Question is, how many carrots do you have to eat to get 50 grams of carbohydrate? You have to eat 700 grams of carrots. You have to eat 1.4 pounds of carrots to get 50 grams of carbohydrate because it's all fiber. Carrots are all fiber, and fiber is good, and fiber is actually mitigating the glucose rise. So carrots are high glycemic index, low glycemic load. Well, every food is a low glycemic load food if it came out of the ground and didn't get processed.
Okay. Interesting. So glucose monitors, good, bad, new, they're stuck in people's arms. You can see them at the pools. I mean, tell me what you think of those, because they're pretty innovative.
Yeah. So basically glucose, first of all, I have to, full disclosure, I am an advisor to Levels Health, which is a glucose monitor software company. So people need to understand that.
Okay.
One of the reasons I joined is because I see the value in it.
Okay.
Continuous glucose monitoring is a proxy for insulin.
Right.
And insulin's the important thing. So if you can keep your insulin down, you're going to stop all these chronic metabolic diseases. Get the insulin down. Now, an insulin monitor is probably 5 years away, but glucose is a reasonable proxy. So keeping your glucose down is a good idea. And so I'm for continuous glucose monitoring. And that's one of the reasons I help Levels Health and why I actually do support this. The problem, of course, is that currently insurance companies won't pay for glucose monitors unless you actually have frank diabetes. And I think this is a mistake.
Yeah, I hear you. Our science is not quite where it needs to be. And but in terms of some of these studies, like I don't think we got into the cell study, but essentially the long and the short of it is this wonderful group out of Israel published their second article. I mean, first was 2014. Now they just come out with a new one. Tell us about the new article really briefly so people get an idea. And this is about artificial sweeteners, which they call non-nutritive sweeteners. When did that change? But anyway.
No, it's been called that for a while.
Okay.
So they looked at stevia and aspartame and sucralose and saccharin.
So the four
artificial sweeteners. Right. The 4 different color packets. And they had the appropriate controls. And what they did was they gave these sweeteners or control to 20 people at a time, and 20 people per arm, 6 arms, and looked at their glucose tolerance and their microbiome 1 month later.
And oral microbiome too, oral and gut.
Yeah, right. And what they showed was that sucralose and saccharin had a general effect of altering glucose tolerance and the microbiome. And as they altered the microbiome, the glucose tolerance changed. What they then did, which was really important. Can I just remind
people, sucralose and saccharin are Splenda and Sweet and Low.
That's right. Splenda and Sweet and Low.
Just because of the
others are Truvia and Equal.
Equal, right.
Right. But aspartame has its own other problems. So it's not like, just because it didn't have a problem in this study, it was okay.
Formaldehyde, other issues, yeah.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So what they then did, which was brilliant, was they took the microbiome of the affected humans and they put it into germ-free mice. And they were able to recapitulate the same problem with glucose intolerance in the germ-free mice, proving that it was the change in the microbiome that caused the change in the glucose tolerance. Now, there are still many questions to be answered. It's not like this study answered all of them. But what this study did do was it did demonstrate causation, and it did do it with appropriate controls. And that's why this is a landmark study. This is a study that the food industry is not going to be able to dismiss out of hand.
Although they tried to say that all the food wasn't controlled for, and, there
they
were confounders with, right, of course. And then the question I had was, which one came first? Did the sweeteners, artificial sweeteners, change the microbiome that changed the glucose, or did the glucose change the microbiome? And that was teased out when they took the sample, the fecal from the patients, the humans, and gave it to the mice. Right. They show they could recreate it. That was fascinating.
That's right. That's right.
So really great study.
I think they did this study correctly, and they are to be congratulated.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. So last couple of questions. Do you think, I know, right? I'll keep you all day. Are you hopeful for the future? There's an integrative medicine movement. All the players in that, Andy Weil and all that. There's a functional medicine movement. Do you think, and then there's issues with the health and wellness world. I have to get that in, because the whole blaming of patients for not doing ultra strict diets, and that's still also in the health and wellness world. It's not just the Western world. So there's issues. But what are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful because we're getting some progress. We're seeing some, real science come out. Now, I will tell you that progress is not a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
Research is not a straight line. It's a zigzag. Okay. And right now we're zigging, and later we'll be zagging. But eventually it goes forward, and it's still better than standing in place. And that's what we did for the last 50 years. And that's how we got into this mess. So I am hopeful. I do see, glimmers of hope on the horizon. I do see a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's going to require everybody getting on board. And it's going to require the food industry getting on board. And, there are food industry actors who do get it and are starting to think about how to fix the problem. And I am working with the World Economic Forum and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in an attempt to try to influence these various industry actors. But I will tell you, everyone's worried about their profit margin. They're all worried about their bottom line. They're all worried about their Wall Street quarterly report. And as long as that's the overriding consideration, it's going to be a tooth and nail battle.
Yeah. I'm hopeful when training programs teach doctors more and more, when medical schools change. I'm waiting for it. But yeah, I think that's a really great answer. And then in terms of 5 recommendations, on your video, Sugar the Bitter Truth, you had a really nice couple of end slides that talked about sort of what you tell your patients, your obese pediatric patients that you're seeing.
Right.
And tell me what are some 5 takeaways for this audience that might be very helpful about fructose and diet and all that?
Number 1, a calorie is not a calorie. And fructose is not glucose. That's number 1. Number 2, 74% of all the items in the American grocery store are spiked with added sugar for their purposes, not for yours. Mm-hmm. Number 3, ultra-processed food is not food. Got that? Ultra-processed food is not food. Because the definition of food is substrate that either contributes to growth or burning of an organism. And ultra-processed food actually inhibits growth and inhibits burning. Okay? Number 4, the food environment that we find ourselves in cannot be changed by you alone. Mm-hmm. You have to basically, you can vote with your fork, and you vote, 21 times a week, but it cannot be changed by you alone. And so you need to, educate your colleagues. You need to educate your friends. You need to educate your politicians. Okay. And last, so it's not, this is going to be a global effort. And then finally, number 5, we have seen 4 cultural tectonic shifts in America in the last 30 years. And here they are: bicycle helmets and seatbelts, smoking in public places, drunk driving, condoms in bathrooms. 4. Now, 30 years ago, if a state legislator stood up in a state house or Congress or Parliament or the Duma or anywhere else in the world and offered legislation for any one of these 4, they got laughed right out of town. Nanny state, liberty interest, get out of my kitchen, get out of my bathroom, get out of my car. Today, they're all facts of life. How do we do that? How did that change? And why did it take 30 years? Answer: we taught the children. The children grew up and they voted. And the naysayers are dead. Okay?
Yep.
That's why it's a generational shift. In fact, you can effectuate cultural tectonic shifts, but it's not because you change people's minds. It's because you create new ones.
I love that. That's why I love high school kids. Yeah.
So that's what we have to do. We have to educate the public now. We have to educate the children now.
I love it. Thank you so much.
And we're doing it.
We're doing it. And I see lots of fingers everywhere, hands in different pots, and really trying to, stick to your lane, but do it well and be, have integrity and follow the science.
Right.
Follow the science.
Do it with the science.
Listen, Dr. Lustig, I can't thank you enough. I really enjoyed our time talking together. I want to plug your book again, not that I have to, just because I want to. It's a very great, it's a great read, and it's entertaining as much as a daunting topic can be. Like it's stuff, daunting. It's you want to go drink, but before you drink, now you'll know what to drink and how much. So it kind of makes all good sense once you read the book. Thank you for your time. Keep doing all the great work you're doing. It is so impressive. I was nervous, as you know, in the beginning. I was repeating and taping over the beginning, but it's out of respect. And I really do like to, hang with the big guys, gals, and guys. So thank you so much for taking the time to be part of my show. And
my
the audience
pleasure,
appreciate it. Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.